Hello again, everybody. This is going to be the first video in a new series where I go through and give my thoughts on all the artifacts in One Step from Eden. The way we're going to split this up is I'm going to make this a 4-part series, and I'm going to split the artifacts up based on their rarity. First video is going to be going through the white rarity artifacts, then the blue ones, then the purple ones, and finally the gold ones. So there's a lot of artifacts in this game. In fact, I think there's about as many artifacts as there are cards in the game. So I'm just gonna get in here and start talking about them because it's gonna take a while. I'm also gonna try to go through them a bit quicker than I went through most cards, just because there's so many of them. So 3D printer is very mediocre. Adding a kunai to your deck every time you shuffle is not terribly impactful, and it's one of the cards that only does anything when you shuffle. Meaning, if you go through a fight and you don't shuffle before the fight's over, it's done literally nothing. In the case of 3D printer, even when you do shuffle, you still have to wait for the kunai to show up, so it just takes forever for 3D printer to actually have an impact on the fight. I generally don't like this one very much. Even if I'm running kunai synergies, it's still not very good. It's just way too slow. Next up, we got adaptive armor. So adaptive armor is really good against stuff that tends to hit you a lot very quickly. Like, it's good against SD turrets, it's good against diag beams, it's okay against the stuff that likes to rotate around the field, like what Terra does. It's good against that kind of stuff. It's also pretty strong against the turrets that shoot really fast and hostage encounters. Outside of those, it's kind of it doesn't really do a whole lot outside of those situations. Usually, when you put this next to a lot of other common artifacts, it seems okay, but it's one of these that really cares about how much you're getting hit. If you rarely get hit, this kind of sucks, because if you're getting hit only once in the span of every 10 seconds, this does literally nothing. But if you're getting hit all the time, it's pretty decent. So next up, we got Blaze of Glory. I don't like Blaze of Glory because it usually does exactly nothing. Problem is that it's like the stars need to align for Blaze of Glory to do anything. First, you need to kill an enemy. That's step one. So if you're in a boss fight, this does nothing by default, unless it's someone who spawns ads. Then, once you've killed an enemy, another enemy has to just happen to walk into space that left the flame behind within the 10-second or the 14-second time span, I believe it is, for the flame to actually do anything. And the odds of that happening are just so slim. In my opinion, this is... I wouldn't say this is... Like, the thing with artifacts is there's a lot of them that have pros and cons. This is one that is all upside, but the upside is so underwhelming that it's just awful. Most of the time, this will do literally nothing for you. Next up, we got Blue Blood. Blue Blood is very powerful. You'll see me talking a lot about front-loading damage to get through room fights, especially on higher hell passes. And it's very important to front-load damage in those situations. An artifact like Blue Blood that lets you start with full mana lets you get that front load damage out super fast, and it just helps you clear rooms out very quickly before the problem enemies become a problem. So if you're in a room battle and you have a problem enemy that's shown up, like, uh-oh, we got the dude that shoots the spinning discs as well as the dude that breaks tiles and someone else, that's an awful room configuration. If we can just burst the spinning disc dude down ASAP, then the room suddenly isn't such an issue, and Blue Blood helps us do that so well. Additionally, it makes max mana much better, because it lets you front load even more damage that way. Blue Blood is, in my opinion, one of the best all-around artifacts in the game, and generally I would pick it up every time I see it. It's that strong. Next up, we got Bubble. So I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about stack defense in general. It's kind of the same deal as shields, except not quite as impactful, because most shots that you actually care about are going to hit you for a lot of damage in one hit, and defense isn't very good in that situation. So if you're getting hit a lot, defense is pretty decent, but again, it just depends how often you get hit. It's the same thing with shields. If you're getting hit a lot, defense is okay. If you're getting hit rarely ever, it's mostly useless. So, Bubble. In terms of artifacts that give defense, I think Bubble is one of the better ones, because 5 defense is way up on the higher end of the spectrum of defense you get. The caveat here is that you need to be running a flow strategy for this to do anything. Again, like with shield, if I want defense, I want my defense to be reliable. I want it to be there all the time when I need it. So for Bubble to be good in that circumstance, I need to be having flow up most of the time. So generally, I think Bubble's pretty solid in a dedicated flow deck, or a deck that has enough flow economy to have flow up most of the time. Outside of that, I wouldn't bother. However, I do think in the event you do have a good flow economy going on, Bubble is definitely way up on the stronger end of defense giving relics. Next up, we got Choco Mint Chip. This is a very strong relic. It is one of the many artifacts. It's one of the many artifacts that synergize with Frost. There's a lot of them, and they tend to be really good. So, what Choco Mint Chip does is it slows down every action that an enemy takes when you apply Frost to them. This is very powerful, and it's a pretty big slow too. Against bosses like Shiso, this just wrecks him, because when he's slowed down, his attacks are so much easier to dodge, and the same applies to the rest of the bosses too. It just slows them down. And while they're slowed down, it also makes it easier to land more Frost and slow them more and apply more Frost and so on and so on. If you have enough Frost stuff going on in your deck, you can pretty much perma-slow people, because this thing lasts for a long time. This is one of the artifacts I think is strong enough to take while you have no Frost in the early game, and then just try to get more Frost speculatively. It's that good. And this is one I tend to take quite often, because in a lot of builds I just happen to end up with some Frost at some point, and even a little bit of Frost makes this worthwhile. It's a very good artifact, and I highly recommend taking it. Next up, we got Citrine. Citrine starts on Pyroterra, and it's really strong there, obviously. It's like her entire mana source. But in general, I think Citrine is a very, very powerful artifact, because there's a few things going on here that are very good about it. Firstly, if you just have Flame taking on one enemy, it's very good, because this is like 2 mana veins. If you have it taking on more than one enemy, this is even better, because then it's like 4+ mana veins. Additionally, if you have flames on the field and there's a very fast moving boss, very mobile boss like Celicy, the way flame works is every second an enemy is staying on an inflamed tile, they'll take the damage, and every time they move into an inflamed tile, they'll take the damage. So if a boss moves around a lot, they'll take that damage like multiple times per second, and then it's also giving you a ton of mana regen. And I think Flame is agnostic enough that it's a strategy that tends to show up in most of my decks. So if I see Citrine, generally I'll take it, under the assumption that eventually I will have some Flames in my deck. I'll find a Firewall, I'll find stuff that applies Flame on hit in forms of upgrades, I'll pick up a Ring of Fire, who knows, but generally it's a safe assumption that in most builds I will have some flame in them at some point, so Citrine is just really good in that case. And it's one that I think quite highly of. Next up we got Empty Bottle. This one is pretty okay for clearing room battles. It's not nearly as good as Blue Blood, but it's okay. The reason for this is generally after you've killed an enemy, it tends to be one of the problem enemies, and as a result, you generally don't need the mana as badly anymore because you've already eliminated a problem threat, and that's giving you some breathing room. However, the mana is nice. This is a relic that's all upside. It's one that I tend to take quite often because common artifacts tend to show up quite often early game, and some of the weaker synergy artifacts will show up alongside it, and I'll think, do I really want to take one of these mediocre synergy artifacts? Or would I rather take an okay-ish artifact that is going to be useful all the time without any synergy? And that's why I generally end up taking Empty Ball a lot. And it's okay, it's not the most impressive thing ever, but it does work sometimes. Sometimes it's just useless, like on most boss fights, but it does good work. Next up we got Explosive Tendons. So here's the thing with Explosive Tendons. It really depends on what Hell Pass you're playing on. If you're playing pre-Hell Pass 11, they kind of suck because they're gonna kill hostages so often. Like the random explosive tendons just kill the hostage every time. And post Hell Pass 11, it's a little bit better because you care less about collateral, and AoE is a bit better because there's higher enemy density in general. But overall, this is just a very unexciting relic. It also catches flak from SD turret. It can open snake capsules if you're unlucky. It's just, eh. It's like, it's kind of like Blaze of Glory, but if Blaze of Glory also had some downside to it. But in terms of the potential upside, it's better than Blaze of Glory because it can deal with clumps of enemies on room battles. I tend to rate this about equally to Blaze of Glory. They're both super, super mediocre, and generally, if I have an option outside them that actually makes sense, I'll take that instead. If I end up getting offered like Medkit while I'm full HP, Blaze of Glory, and Explosive Tendons, that's just like. And this happens all the time, I swear. But generally, in that case, I'll probably take the Explosive Tendons, but maybe I'll take the Blaze of Glory. It just really doesn't matter that much, though. Next up, we got Glass Cannon. I think this is a very powerful artifact, but one with the very real downside. The one fragile, if you're someone who doesn't get hit super often, but generally takes a decent hit like every other room battle or so, this one fragile is a big deal. However, the 4 spell power is also really good. And the fragile synergies are actually pretty solid when you have a few of them. If you have like the beaker or the mirror as well, then this is suddenly an upside. And generally, I think the one fragile is worth having the 4 spell power unless you're already deeply invested into a build that doesn't care much about spell power. Because 4 spell power is pretty substantial. So this is one that I tend to take quite often because it tends to show up a lot next to stuff like the aforementioned Blaze of Glory or Explosive Tendons, which I just don't care about. So I take this one quite often. The one fragile can be a big deal, but usually the 4 spell power is worth the one fragile. Next up we got Harpoon. This one is another one that's kind of in the same category as Bubble. However, since it's spell power instead of defense, I think it's a bit better than Bubble because the spell power is going to be useful pretty much always. However, the spell power is also kind of awkward because most flow spells don't care much about spell power, which kind of sucks. Most spell power builds don't use flow, however, this is kind of a weird artifact in that way because it cares about flow, but it's giving you spell power, which is kind of contradictory. It's okay, but it's the kind of artifact I would not take unless I'm already invested in a flow build. I'll never take this speculatively because it's not that good. Because if I take it and then I end up building a deck that's really good with spell power, odds are that deck's not going to have enough flow for Harpoon to do much of anything. And if I end up building a deck that has a really good flow economy, odds are that deck doesn't care much about spell power. So this is one that is okay, like it's pretty non-offensive, it's not gonna harm you in any way, but it's just very, very mediocre. Next up we got Heart of the Cards. Chrono Saffron starts with this, and generally this is one I tend to take quite highly in the early game because I like to, if I'm trying to win, I'll generally favor a larger deck over a smaller deck, because that means I can put more consume stuff in there, I can front load more damage, I get more mana regen, etc., etc. And generally, Heart of the Cards does a lot of work when you pick it up early. It's also healing that you can take while you're at full HP, and it kind of puts the healing on layaway. Like you get it over time, so it doesn't really matter that much if you're at full HP because you're probably going to take damage at some point. And having the healing occur passively like this just lets you take more shops, it lets you skip campfires and all that good stuff. It lets you take harder fights and so on and so on. I like this artifact quite a bit. It's kind of weird because it doesn't give you that instant gratification. It's like a slow trickle in, but when you really think about how much it's healing you over the course of a run, especially if you take it like before stage 3 or 4, it's quite a bit. It's pretty powerful, in fact, especially if you're putting a lot of cards in your deck. So I like this one quite a bit. I tend to rank it as pretty well above average in terms of common artifacts. Next up, we got Hit Seeker. 10% chance to launch a 40 damage missile when a spell hits an enemy. This equates to approximately 4 spell power. And if we look at it that way, this is like 4 spell power on average with no downside or stipulations, and that's pretty strong. Whereas stuff like Harpoon or Glass Cannon is just compared to it. I think this is probably the best of the spell power / on hit stuff type in the common artifact slot, and I tend to take it quite highly. It's definitely way above average when you compare it to a lot of the other common artifacts. Next up we got Ice Flow. This one is pretty interesting because it's kind of, so a lot, the way the upgrade pool works is it seems like certain cards have certain upgrades that are weighted to show up more frequently on them. And what I've noticed is that Frost cards tend to be weighted more towards having flow upgrades, and flow cards tend to be weighted more towards having Frost upgrades. And the Frost and Flow pools, as a result, tend to be a bit more intertwined than other strategies, and Ice Flow kind of ties that all together. Ice Flow allows you to put Frost cards in your Flow deck, or put Flow cards in your Frost deck, and have the appropriate Flow economy to make it work. And when you do make it work, that means you can double dip on all these Flow and Frost artifacts, which there are a lot of. I think overall this is a pretty powerful artifact. It kind of ties the whole Frostflow build together, and I tend to take it quite highly in the early game. However, if I'm already an established strategy that does not care about Frost or Flow, I'll just ignore it. However, if I'm running a deck that has a lot of Frost or a deck that is running a lot of Flow, I will certainly take this over pretty much every other common artifact because of the potential it has. In those cases, that means that you suddenly open up the card pool you have available to you by a huge amount, and you don't have to worry as much about your flow economy, because when you put flow cards in your deck, the flow economy is suddenly a really big deal. So I like this artifact quite a bit. I think it's quite powerful, and I think it has a higher ceiling than most common artifacts. Next up, we got Knife Belt. This is like what 3D printer wishes it was. So Knife Belt is essentially just free front load damage. The only downside to it really is that it kind of sucks if you have flow stuff going on. But I think this is a pretty solid artifact because it's just giving you free front load damage. It's playing off any kunai synergies you have instantly in the first shuffle. We don't have to wait to shuffle and then wait for a kunai to show up, and then we only get one. I think this is a pretty decent way to get some free front load damage into the deck in the early game, and if you've just happened to pick up some stuff that has kunai synergy along the way, this is pretty decent as well. If you're running a dedicated kunai package, this is also pretty decent because it's just free kunais. The only issue with it is it's a bit medium, so it's going to show up next to a lot of other artifacts that you might want instead. But I do like this quite a bit. I think it's pretty much all upside outside the case of flow decks. Next up, we got Mana Jam. I really, really like Mana Jam. For the same reason I really, really like Railgun. It's a very powerful artifact. It's like, in terms of common artifacts, I think this is S tier easily. Not when we get into the higher rarities though, but anyway, you add 3 jams to your deck, and the 3 jams will always be at the bottom of your deck. You get 0.3 mana regen. This is an artifact that I pretty much always take unless I have a very, very good reason not to, because in larger decks, you'll just never get to a jam, so it won't matter. You just have 3 mana veins for free, essentially. In smaller decks, the 0.3 mana regen generally offsets the cost of jams because the 3 jams will cost you 6 mana. 6 mana will take 20 seconds for the mana jam to generate. So if it's on a boss fight, the mana jam will still probably be all upside because I'm sure the boss fight will take more than 20 seconds. The only time this is not worth it is if you're in a battle that lasts less than 20 seconds and you end up having to cast all the jams. However, if you're running a jam package in the deck that's running like Railgun and Jam Slam, or especially Jam Cannon, then this is very, very powerful. I mentioned this when I talked about Jam Cannon, but one of my favorite combos that's really easy to put together in the game is I'll find a mana jam, then I'll find a Jam Cannon, and then I'll get a 2 times damage and consume upgrade on the Jam Cannon. And what this does is, without any other jam cards in a deck, my Jam Cannon will now do 480 damage for 0 mana and consume. And then I'll cast the jams from the mana jam if they come up, and then it won't matter anymore because all that stuff's out of the deck, including the Jam Cannon. I think Mana Jam is very powerful. I take it quite highly. Don't worry too much about the jams it puts in the deck. Trust me, it's very, very good. Next up, we got Micro Missiles. So, This is one of those artifacts that's very, very character dependent. Like, if you're running, say, I don't know, Zealousy, this is awful, obviously. However, if you're running, like, Bullet Hell Gunner or Saffron, then this is quite a bit better. However, the problem with those builds is that attack power is generally a very, very weak strategy because bosses gain defense passively every tier. As a result, a lot of times your E attack is going to end up doing 1 damage anyway, especially on Saffron, and that's the same with the micro missiles. The other one that really springs to mind is Execute Shiso, but that one's kind of weird because I don't know if you're. I guess it's good in boss fights in that case. Yeah. You can take this on boss fights on Execute Shiso, and it's pretty good there because you're essentially increasing your damage output by 50% on them, which is great. Room fights on them though, it's kind of eh. On the other loadouts that care a lot about their base attack, it's also because base attacks aren't very good in the first place. Overall, I think this one's just okay. The problem with a lot of these artifacts, like I said, is the opportunity cost. We have to compare them to all the other artifacts at the same rarity because odds are we're going to have to pick between one of them. And I think micro missiles is below average, so most of the time you won't pick it. There's just going to be another artifact you're being offered that's way better. Next up, we got Mint Tea. Mint Tea is very, very good because Frost is very, very good ever since the buff to 150 damage on Frost. All these Frost things have been very, very good because Frost is a very powerful strategy. When you get Mint Tea, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's just mana regen built into your Frost energy. Obviously, if you're not running Frost energy, it's not very good, but if you are running Frost energy, it is very good. I think it's good enough with Frost energy that you take it even when you don't have any Frost stuff going on, and then trying to get Frost stuff. In fact, if you're just trying to win, I imagine you would probably pick up some Frost stuff along the way anyway. But yeah, Mint Tea is pretty good. It works really well with your Frost stuff that you're inevitably going to pick up. I think generally this is about as good as 2 mana veins in a Frost deck on average. Some Frost builds can do way better than that, and this is one I take quite often. Next up, we got Moonstone, which is the same as, well, no, it's not the same. You gain 0.2 mana regen for each broken tile. Break Terra starts with this, and it's absolutely critical there, but you don't really have to worry about it there because you start with it anyway. But she cannot function without this in the early game. On other characters, it's just kind of mediocre because tile breaking cards are kind of few and far between, and then they're super specific, and they tend to be really mediocre. And so Moonstone ends up being really mediocre. So the thing with this is you take it because it's very, very good on the Terra fight. If you haven't fought Terra yet and you're worried about her, or you just want to save some HP, Moonstone is very, very good against her. So you can take it there. The other case is if you've picked up like a Sugar Glass, which we'll talk about in a bit. It's also pretty good because this is essentially front-loading mana regen. Outside of those cases, it's just not that good because cards that crack or break tiles tend to not be that good. The only one that's really at all worth talking about, in my opinion, that doesn't repair its own tiles, i.e. Tremor, is Fisher, I believe it's called, the one that pushes enemies side. That one's pretty decent, but even then, it's not enough to make this worthwhile. Generally, they're just going to be better artifacts next to it you'd rather have. Next up, we got Pinwheel. I don't think haste is very good. It doesn't really do a whole lot. There aren't really any attacks in the game that require you to be moving any faster than the base movement speed to avoid them. Generally, I think you would just rather have the other artifacts in the pool. This is one where if you're just given it by itself from a chest, sure, you'll take it, but it's not very impressive. Generally, I would take most other common artifacts over this. Next up, we got Poison Vial. So, Poison Vial is interesting because on the surface, this is only doing 30 damage to every enemy at the start of battle, and that's okay. It's just okay, though. It takes 8 seconds for the 30 damage to happen, however, it does go through shield and defense, and that's a big deal. And that's probably the biggest strong point here. So Poison Vial is doing 30 damage to all the enemies over 8 seconds to start battle, which isn't terribly impressive, but it's something. It's worth considering. It's all upside there. Where this really shines is against the super annoying guys in the runes that have like 250 defense, and they just sit there and harass you. And they're a pain to kill in the early game when you don't have stuff that hits for a ton of damage or fire or frost ready to go. It's very good there because this just kills them pretty much instantly after 4 seconds because they tend to only have 20 HP most of the time. It's also good on the chests that have a ton of defense. Basically, it's good against all the stuff that has a ton of defense because it just goes right through defense. But yeah, I generally take this one quite highly because for a common artifact, it has quite a bit of versatility. It's always useful, although it's one of the artifacts that's always doing something. It's always providing some value, but the value is very minor except in the couple circumstances I mentioned. So this is one I will actually take over a lot of the other common artifacts, just because I know it's always going to be useful. Next up, we got Riffle. Riffle has kind of a similar issue to 3D Printer, but it's a little bit better than 3D Printer because you don't have to wait to shuffle and then wait for the kunai to show up for this to do something. So it acts faster than 3D Printer. However, once you start getting more than like 15 cards in a deck, this effect just becomes bad. These things that require you to shuffle to do anything are just, in general, kind of eh. Except for the ones that reduce your shuffle time, those tend to be pretty alright. But yeah, I don't really care for Riffle. It's okay for some extra damage in the early game, and I think it's the best one of these common artifacts of this sub-theme. But I don't think it's super powerful. It's kind of in the same vein as Poison Vial, except much worse than Poison Vial, because Poison Vial always works. With Riffle, you have to shuffle for it to work. So this is one that I'll only take if the other artifacts being offered are super mediocre and it's really early in the run and I just want a bit of damage. But overall, I don't think this is terribly impressive. Next up, we got Rock Tumbler. This one has the same problem as 3D Printer, except in a little bit of a different way. The problem with this one is if you're taking this, presumably you're taking it because your flow economy is no good. But it doesn't give you flow economy at the start of battle, so the first time through a deck, this isn't helping you at all. It's only helping you the second time through, except by that point the fight's almost over, probably, and by that point the flow economy is not as important, I suspect. The thing is, if you're taking this, that means that you really want the flow economy, right? But if you really want the flow economy, that means you're taking other things that are helping you with the flow economy as well, meaning that in a little while, this won't be necessary anymore because you'll have the flow economy figured out with other stuff. that doesn't need to wait for you to shuffle before it works. Generally, I don't care much for Rock Tumbler. The only times I take it are if I'm already in a dedicated flow build and I am running something like Waterfall, or the other options are just awful. So next up we got Scales, which is the last of these common artifacts that do something when you shuffle. I think this one is super mediocre because I don't want to wait until I shuffle to get 20 shield. 20 shield is already pretty unimpressive. It doesn't work in small decks because shield inherently sucks with smaller decks because you lose shield when you shuffle. So it's no good there. It's no good in bigger decks because then you have to wait to shuffle for this to do anything, but odds are you aren't shuffling on most fights, so I don't really know where this goes. It's another one of these that I'll only take if the other options are just awful or actively detrimental to what I'm doing. This one's no good. Stay away from it for the most part. Next up we got Snow Boots. So when frost damage is dealt, you also root the dude for 2 seconds. This artifact is nuts. It is very powerful. So when you haven't hit a critical mass of frost stuff, this is very good because rooting dudes for 2 seconds, that's a long time. That's twice as long as Amalgam. And that's going to give you the time you need to set up the next attack on them and guarantee it's going to hit. However, when you have hit that critical mass of frost stuff, what this does is it's going to root them indefinitely because you're going to root them with the frost, and while they're rooted, you're going to apply more frost, and it's going to proc again, and they'll be rooted again, and so on until you either hit a mana deficiency or you have to shuffle, or they're dead. But overall, this is one of the most powerful common artifacts. This is one that I'll take very early in the run and try to force a frost strategy around it because I got the snow boots. And if I already have frost in the deck, I'm certainly taking this. It's just very good. Next up we got Stoplight, which is like if snow boots were for trendy, but it kind of wasn't as good. It was just kind of mediocre. So Stoplight is okay. Obviously, it's only good if you're running a Trinity package. However, the Trinity package is kind of mediocre in general. So it roots all enemies for 1 second on Trinity cast. The way you're meant to use this is you're supposed to use it to guarantee that whatever you're Trinity casting is going to hit. Generally, that means you're using this to guarantee you're hitting your Tri-Rag. And it's great for that, because it does just that. It guarantees that your Tri-Rag is going to hit the thing that it needs to hit. So it's pretty good there. However, unlike Snow Boots, I don't think this is good enough to take speculatively, because I don't think Trendy is that good. If you're already in a trendy build, I think this is pretty alright. But outside of that, I would say nah. Next up, we got Sugar Glass, which cracks 6 enemy tiles at the start of battle. That's a third of the enemy field. And this one's kind of a mixed bag, because sometimes it can really help you pin enemies in place and guarantee that you're going to be able to take them out in a timely manner, but sometimes it can mess with the enemy movement patterns and get them stuck in weird places, or cause projectiles to bounce around in weird ways that you weren't expecting. This one, I think overall is pretty solid. It's another one of these that helps you front load damage, which, if you haven't noticed already, is something I think is very important. It doesn't let you front load damage in the same way as other stuff, though, because essentially it's not doing damage itself, it's just helping you guarantee that you're able to land damage. I think it's pretty solid for that. I considered this one as kind of a dead average common artifact, and generally when I put it next to two other common artifacts, I tend to end up taking it about a third of the time. It's just super average. Notably, as I mentioned earlier, if I take this early on in the run and then later on I'm offered a Moonstone next to some other mediocre common artifacts, I'm much more likely to take the Moonstone, because together these help me not only pin enemies in place in the early stage of the fight, ensuring that I can land my stuff on them, now they also give me an extra injection of mana regen, which is really nice. So now not only am I guaranteeing that or probably guaranteeing that I'm landing stuff on enemies, I'm also being given the mana to do so. Next up, we got Tessellate, which I guess is the last one of these common shuffle artifacts. Turns out Scale was not the last one, but Tessellate kind of has the same problem as all these other common shuffle artifacts, except this one is a little bit better because it's giving you something a little bit more tangible. Unlike Rock Tumbler, the one trendy is always really useful in a trendy build because it's guaranteeing that more of your stuff is going to be able to be trendy cast. In a trendy build, unless something really bizarre happens, generally you're not going to be able to try cast 100% of your trendy stuff. Tesla does help you with that, however, it falls in the same problem as all these other ones, where it's not doing anything until the later stages of a fight, which is kind of unfortunate. Next up, and finally, we got Thorn Mail. So whenever you get hit, this deals 10 damage to all enemies. By itself, with no memey stuff going on, this is just really mediocre. It's okay against multi-hitting stuff like Diag Beams, but that's about it. Generally, I would expect for the average player, this is achieving 20 to 30 AoE damage per room fight, and maybe 80 to 100 damage per boss fight, which is okay. It's comparable to Poison Vial in that case, which is a pretty solid artifact. However, if you're not getting hit at all, which you should be striving to do, this suddenly becomes useless. The other case is if you're running the Beat Riva meme stuff, where you're running like Pinch and Pong and Transfusion and all this other stuff, then this becomes quite a bit better. Overall, I think this is one that's kind of really core to the Beat Riva meme build, but outside that, it's just kind of average, maybe a little bit below, maybe a little bit above average for common artifacts. It's one that I'm just kind of indifferent to, and really it's okay. It's not bad, but it's not spectacular either. Like I'm never getting excited over Thornmail. So that covers our common artifacts. There are some really strong ones in the common slot. There are also some really crappy ones in the common slot, but that's going to be the case with every artifact rarity, as we will see in the future. The difference is that the common artifacts, the ones that do have detrimental effects, tend to be less detrimental than the effects at higher rarities. The higher we go up in the rarity here, the more crippling the detrimental effects are going to get, as you'll see. So that's what I think of all the common artifacts. I'll see you guys next time when we go through the rare artifacts. Bye-bye.